Hello, darlings. I'm back once again talking about something that required a load of research and that I can't possibly cover all of in just one video. Oops. Anyway, thank you very much for all your lovely kind words on my last video and your additions of anything that I missed. Like, it was really, really genuinely interesting to read. Thank you so much, guys. It was really lovely. Before we get into it, I have been told that I need to tell you guys about a Doctor Who fan film that we made back in the lockdown of 2020. It's available on a channel that I will link above if I can figure out how to do that. Anyway, we made it in our student halls on the budget of like a shoestring, so I suppose, you know, it's a true tribute. Anyway, give that a watch if you care to. Also, I wasn't able to monetize my past couple of videos because of copyright, which is probably my own fault for not really thinking about that. But if you want, you can buy me a coffee on Ko-Fi, which I will also link below. Obviously, no pressure, you don't have to do that. So in my last video, I mentioned fanzines as one of the starting points for the Doctor Who fandom. What I didn't mention is that I absolutely went down a internet rabbit hole trying to find as much fanzine content that I could. So I thought, hey, why not revisit some of that? Fanzines. What are they?
So what is it?
Well, the short answer is that they're unofficial physical publications made by fans for fans. They can include fanfic, meta-analysis, reviews, poems, anything. Some fanzines could focus on one media property or just one type of contribution, such as Mandria, which focused specifically on Doctor Who fanfiction, or they could be multi-fandom. Or multimedia, as I think they were known around the times that fanzines were big, and include many different types of contributions, such as Neutron Flow, where this half of the zine is Doctor Who focused, and then there's Reverse Polarity on the other side, which focuses more on general sci-fi, so James Bond, Stephen King, and Arthurian legend. Obviously, though, I'm going to give you the long answer. For the long answer, we're going to have to go back about 100 years to the birth of science fiction fandom in the 1920s. Now, science fiction, or more specifically speculative fiction, has existed for much longer than 100 years. There are sci-fi elements in the Arabic folk tales of 101 Nights, which date from the Islamic Golden Age, and there are plenty of other stories that date from even further back that can be argued to fit into an early version of the science fiction genre. I think modern consensus agrees that the genre of sci-fi that we know it today started with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, with Jules Verne and H.G. Wells helping to define it later on. Whilst fans of these and many other science fiction authors certainly existed, it wasn't until Hugo Gernsback published his first American sci-fi, or as he called it, scientifiction magazine, which was called Amazing Stories, that the science fiction fandom really began to emerge. Fun fact, in Mass Effect 2, the crashed ship that you come across in Jacob's personal mission is actually called the MSV Hugo Gernsback. Anyway, Gernsback's science fiction magazine provided the first opportunity for sci-fi fans to communicate with each other. Fans would write into the magazines and Gernsback would publish their addresses, meaning that fans could learn how to get into contact with other fans. This correspondence led to fans meeting up if they were in travelling distance of each other, and then eventually forming fan clubs. Two early clubs were the Science Correspondence Club and the Scienceers, with the former, formed in 1928, supposedly being the first club. But there seems to be an insistence that the Scienceers was the first true sci-fi fan club because it was dedicated purely to science fiction. Something that I found out whilst researching the Scienceers was that the founding president was a man named Warren Fitzgerald, and he and his wife used to host the club in their home in Harlem. Warren and his wife Gertrude were described as being African American by other members of the Scienceers. There is a description from one of the other founding members of the club. I will change one of the words when I read it because it was written in the 1950s and the language used just isn't appropriate for what's acceptable today. He was a light-skinned black man, amiable, cultured, and a fine gentleman in every sense of that word. With his gracious, darker-hued wife, Warren made our young members welcome to use his Harlem home for our meetings, an offer we greatly accepted. Obviously, that description is very dated, but it does show that he was respected by other members of the club, who were mostly Jewish teenage boys. Apparently, there is some debate as to whether Warren Fitzgerald was actually black, because there's a census that lists him as white, with his wife Gertrude and everyone else in the building being listed as black. This could mean that he was a white man in an interracial marriage, he could have been mixed race, or maybe he was just white passing. Or maybe the Warren Fitzgerald listed is just a different Warren Fitzgerald. We may never know, but members of the Sciences clearly believed him to be black, and they still engaged with the club and clearly thought highly of him. I just wanted to share that information because it's a positive story that I wasn't really expecting to find in the 1920s. So back to fanzines. Both the Science Correspondence Club and the Sciences published fanzines in 1930 called The Comet and The Planet, respectively. The Comet was published first, but The Planet seems to be considered to be the first true science fiction fanzine. There's a little quiz in it about the stories that were featured in Hugo Gernsback's Wonder Stories, which I thought was fun. It also includes the question of how future populations will be able to grow enough food to ensure that the growing population doesn't starve. It estimates that the population will reach 5 billion by the year 2028. There's also a poem in it that speculates what the future might look like, suggesting that maybe we'll all grow gills and get our food from pills. But there is one stanza that does feel quite accurate to me. Our clothes will change to garments strange, that now would cause derision, and there will be no privacy, because of television. So the guy who wrote this, Alan Glasser, who was a member of the Sciences and also seemed to be very prominent in the production of a lot of early fanzines, kind of got it right. He says television, but the idea of visual content, which nowadays is usually related to the internet, has resulted in a society where privacy is valued less than perhaps it once was. A later fanzine that was the first to be exclusively science fiction related and not related to the goings-on of club activities or members was The Time Traveller, which was partly edited by Alan Glasser as well. The poem I just mentioned is featured in the second edition of The Time Traveller, but it's credited to C.S. Langle, so I'm not sure which one of them, if either, was the original writer. Or it could be a pen name. I don't know. The Time Traveller ran for 9 issues between early 1932 and late 1933. More fanzines and clubs began to pop up over the next few decades. The term fanzine was coined in 1940 by Russ Chauvenet in the fanzine Detours, where he said, "We hereby protest against the uneuphonious word fanac and announce our intention to plug fanzine as the best short form of fan magazine." Essentially, the science fiction fandom and their fanzines continued through to the 1950s. Most of the information I've come across is US-based, but there were definitely science fiction clubs emerging in the UK around the 1930s, and I'm sure they were self-publishing their own zines as well. In this era of science fiction fandom, it seems that the people who were engaging were a relatively small group who were very dedicated and involved in the fandom. It's also worth noting that other genres were included in early fandom. Sci-fi and fantasy have a significant overlap, and after The Fellowship of the Ring was published in 1954, it was discussed in science fiction fanzines. There were certainly zines created with Tolkien-inspired names, but there aren't that many records of them, so it's hard to tell if they were exclusively Tolkien content or more general sci-fi. In the 1960s, something new came onto the scene of science fiction. Star Trek.
Fascinating.
I know Doctor Who started before Star Trek did, but Star Trek is really what kick-started a big fandom around specific media with specific characters and settings. So, Star Trek began, and people loved it. It was a science fiction show that had provoking plot lines, social commentary that reflected the current state of the world, and it was fun and campy and set in space. So it garnered a pretty big following. Part of the reason that Star Trek appealed to so many people is how diverse it was. There were women and people of colour in the main cast. This version of the future incorporated infinite diversity in infinite combinations. I'm not going to go too deep into Star Trek stuff. It's not really my area of expertise, but I have been watching Jessie Gender's amazing videos on Star Trek. Her video, How /Fiction Saved Star Trek, goes into what I'm about to cover in this section of fanzine history. Anyway, for the first notable time in fandom history, women were starting to become a lot more involved with fandom. Not that women hadn't been involved with fandom beforehand, women have always been involved in it, it's just that in the 1960s, they became a lot more visible with the rise of the likes of Star Trek and the Beatles. So at the beginning of the second season of Star Trek in 1967, a fanzine published by Deborah Langsom and Shirna Comerford emerged. It focused on sex symbol and fan favourite character, Mr. Spock. Spockanalia was a labour of love for these fans. Back in the 60s, finding stills to use as references for your fan art was incredibly difficult, and the art had to be done in ink in order to be able to be reproduced by the mimeograph machine that was used to create copies. In a letter published in the third issue of Spockanalia, Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, described the fanzine as required reading for everyone in our offices. We have used all the extra copies to make sure that every new writer and anyone who makes decisions on show policy has read your fanzine. The first issue also includes a foreword written by Leonard Nimoy himself. The version of Spockanalia that's available to view on the Internet Archive is the third printing from 1968, and it includes poetry, thoughts on Vulcan culture, and a proposed model of the Vulcan heart, which just to name a few things. Something I found quite interesting was the poem, or I suppose song, entitled A Most Illogical Song, which quite clearly shows the female desire that existed for the character of Spock. The opening stanza includes the lines, I wish I was on board the Enterprise. If I was on the Enterprise, I'd look into those Vulcan eyes. I wish I was on board the Enterprise. It then goes through a lot of the members of the bridge crew expressing a desire to be them in relation to Spock. Then towards the end of the poem there are lines like, I wish I could hold Spock in my arms. If I could hold Spock in my arms, he'd find emotion had its charms. I wish that I could hold Spock in my arms. And then, I wish I had spores from Mira 3. If I had spores from Mira 3, then Spock might be turned on by me. I wish I had some spores from Mira 3. There's a lot to go over in Spockanalia, and it could definitely be its own video, but I'll leave that to somebody who has more of a knowledge about Star Trek than I do. Issue 3 of Spockanalia is an interesting one. It contains the short story Visit to a Weird Planet by Jean Laura and Willard F. Hunt. It's about what might happen if a transporter malfunction caused the Star Trek characters to be swapped with their real-world counterparts, which is arguably one of the first instances that could be considered to be a modern RPF story. There is also a fic called The Alternate by Laura Harris, which is about a woman who is in a relationship with the Mirrorverse version of Spock, and it is suggestive. It's clearly a sort of fun, sexy self-insert fic, and there were a lot of self-insert fics happening around this time, but there were complaints about the story, prompting the Spockanalia editors to write about that dirty article on page 49. We've been told that a couple of the items in Spockanalia 3 are embarrassing, dirty, or downright trashy. If we've embarrassed you, we are sincerely sorry. The recurrence of the theme of sex isn't surprising. It is a recurrent theme of life. The recurrence of the theme involving Spock is also unsurprising. We Star Trek femme fans find him attractive and highly masculine. Some of us are articulate, and the result is predictable and even logical. If anyone is seriously concerned, psychiatrists regard such feelings as perfectly normal. If they are non-obsessive, an artistic endeavour is a healthy outlet. Perhaps some of our readers are too accustomed to the tradition in popular literature of the male protagonist being aroused by the presence of attractive women. When they find that women write it the other way round, they find it strange. We, the editors of Spockanalia, try our best to print only material which we consider well-written, interesting to us, and written within our format. We do not choose to limit ourselves by eliminating one effective segment of our submissions. I do personally find female sexuality and desire in fandom a really interesting topic, and that's probably why I enjoyed researching fanzines so much. So after Spockanalia, many other fanzines started to emerge, at first mostly Star Trek based, and then some that focused on shows like Starsky and Hutch, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and Blake's 7. In the 1970s, in both the UK and the US, rock and later punk zines began to emerge, which makes a lot of sense if you think about the DIY aesthetics of both punk and fanzine culture. Again, I'm certainly not an expert on the punk culture of the 1970s, but I do really enjoy the aesthetic of these zines. In the mid-70s, the Doctor Who fandom really started to grow. and in 1975 the first fanzine with exclusively Doctor Who content was published. It was 12 pages long and was priced at just 5p. Adjusted for inflation, that's 49p, and that is about the price of a Freddo at a W.H. Smith's nowadays. The fanzine was called TARDIS, and I don't think there's a copy available online, but there are some articles describing its content. Apparently the focus is mostly on William Hartnell, which was probably due to the fact that he passed away just 6 weeks before the zine was published. It includes a checklist of First Doctor stories, which Richard Molesworth notes in his article about the zine would have been pretty hard to find pre-internet era. There's also a review of the Doctor Who stage play 7 Keys to Doomsday. The editor of this zine, Andrew Johnson, only worked on the first issue before passing over to Gordon Blowes on the second issue. In that second issue, Johnson stated that he found the new episodes of Doctor Who stereotyped and cliché-ridden. He said, "The current Doctor Who adventure is one concerning mummies and pyramids. I can't for the life of me remember the title." So good to know the whole "it's not as good as it used to be" thing has just always existed. TARDIS later on became the official fanzine of the Doctor Who Appreciation Society. Something I found out as well was that in issue 5 of TARDIS there's a review of the Blackpool Doctor Who exhibition from 1976. That exhibition actually reopened in 2004, and I used to go there in the summer holidays. I can exclusively report that it very much looked the exact same as I assume it did in the 1970s. The 1970s is also when slash fiction is commonly believed to have originated, though we do know that there were stories being passed around privately amongst fans before then. These are sometimes called drawer fics, as in a fic that you would keep in your sock drawer and only share with your close friends. One of these types of fics was British writer Jennifer Guttridge's The Ring of Saussure, a Kirk/Spock fic which was written in 1968 and was credited with the invention of, or at least the popularisation of, the cave sex and f*** or die trope, which, to be honest, is inspired by Ponfar in Star Trek canon. So, Star Trek invented f*** or die. I don't think I can keep saying these words. I'm going to get demonetized again. The Ring of Saussure would later be published without Guttridge's permission or even knowledge in the zine Alien Brothers in 1987. She had supposedly said herself that she wanted to meet Leonard Nimoy, but not in court. Slash fic at the time was a very underground subject, and the legal status of fanfic in general was still up in the air. There were also obscenity laws in the UK that slash fic publishers were probably in violation of. Anyway, The Ring of Saussure is quite hard to find online, but Prince Nimoy on Tumblr managed to track down a physical copy of it and took pictures of all the pages, which have been uploaded to Dropbox if you want to track it down. Obviously, be prepared for slash and sexy imagery. Whilst being on the subject of Kirk and Spock, I would like to formally apologise for calling James Tiberius Kirk straight in my last video. I was obviously referring to him repeatedly being portrayed as actively into women, and Gene Roddenberry did try to no-homo that ship in his Star Trek The Motion Picture novelisation. However, I also acknowledge that their relationship is super homoerotic, they're also in love with each other and super not straight, so I hope that clears up my stance on the subject. In 1977, another major science fiction, or I suppose, space fantasy, property appeared in the form of Star Wars.
Well, I was going into Toshi Station to pick up some power converters.
I got distracted whilst writing this because I started reading a Star Wars fanzine from 1979, and it was so interesting seeing fan interpretation based only on the information from the first film. So the one I was reading was Time Warp Issue 3 by Anne Elizabeth Zeke and Ruth B. Goltzman. And I ended up reading Cats in the Dark by Joyce Yasner. And I've seen a post that's like, oh, if the original trilogy came out today, then everybody would be thirsting after Vader. And yeah, they were doing that in the 1970s anyway. Personally, I can understand the Vader girlies more than I can understand the Kylo girlies. The other fun fanon patterns that I noticed in a lot of 70s and 80s fan works was that people considered Sith to be Anakin's home planet where he was nobility on, so literally a Lord of Sith. Luke's mother is very typically a self-insert OC. Obi-Wan is frequently characterized as a very cold and calculating person, which I suppose works with his character in the original trilogy, but also I hate it. There does seem to be a general consensus that Obi-Wan is responsible for Anakin getting all toasty, so that's accurate at least. Also, there's a lot of his legal name is Darth Vader, as in first name Darth, last name Vader. Again, Obi-Wan calls him Darth, so it's a fair assumption that that's his name rather than a title. By the time The Empire Strikes Back had come out in 1980, Star Wars fanzines had actually surpassed Star Trek fanzines. Unfortunately, that also meant that a certain type of fanzine was brought to the attention of one George Lucas. Fans had been pretty much given free rein with Star Trek fanworks. The creator of the show had given his blessing, and Paramount wasn't actively hunting down copyright breaches, even with the more explicit content. Lucasfilm was a little less lax with fanworks, requesting that zine publishers send 4 copies of each issue to them. A lot of people who sent in their issues failed to be paid properly for their contribution and had to actively track down payments. Liaisons for the official Star Wars fan club requested that no X-rated or gay content be published, and this information was passed from fan to fan, so there was a lot of confusion and rumour accompanying this information. Obviously, that didn't stop people writing, publishing, and sharing their work, some of which Lucasfilm took notice of. The first letter to zine publishers was sent to publishers of the Zine Guardian in 1981, and it was in response to the PG-13 Han/Leia story, Slow Boat to Bespin. An excerpt from the letter reads, "I think you should seriously consider your responsibility to Lucasfilm, the copyright owner of these materials, and to many loyal fans whose high regard for the Star Wars saga is based in part on the wholesome character that everyone associates with it. Any damage that you do to this character hurts both Lucasfilm and the fans, and it would be irresponsible for you to act without a sense of duty you owe to both. Therefore, this letter is to put you to notice of our strong position against any X-rated treatment of Star Wars characters, and to demand your written assurance that you will make no further use of the characters in this manner." The zine editors published a response saying that they had been assured that the author had sent the story to Lucasfilm for approval. They also humbly requested that Lucasfilm publish a set of guidelines, since they clearly had different definitions of what X-rated meant. A letter was sent to general zines, reminding them not to publish anything pornographic. A separate letter was sent to zines that had published material that Lucasfilm didn't approve of, informing them that Lucasfilm would take legal action if publication of this material continued. In 1981, a zine called Imperial Entanglement sent a story called Hoth Admiral, which was a non-explicit story featuring Admiral Piet in a relationship with a male OC, to Lucasfilm for approval. The response to this story was, "We're terribly sorry, but we cannot authorize homosexual expression of love among the characters created by George Lucas. This controversial subject must remain detached from the world created by Lucasfilm, in order to preserve the innocence even Imperial crew members must be imagined to have." The response urged the author to change the story to not include homosexual themes and explore a different theme. It also recommended that the author rework the story to include their own original characters instead. I'm so glad that the wholesomeness of Admiral Piet was protected. I literally had to Google him. He's the guy that gets promoted by Vader after he chokes that other officer over space Skype. Editor of Imperial Entanglements, Karen Osmond, sent a letter of complaint to Lucasfilm, arguing that the story was non-explicit, and not allowing non-explicit gay fics whilst allowing non-explicit het fics was discriminatory towards gay and lesbian people. After a month, rumours began to emerge that Lucasfilm would be reversing their decision on slash fiction, and one of the authors of Hoth Admiral wrote directly to the head of the official Star Wars fan club, Maureen Garrett, for clarification on the issue. She responded, "This is to confirm our conversation that we do not object to fan-written stories involving homosexual characters, as long as they, too, remain non-explicit about sex and within the rather nebulous bounds of good taste." Hoth Admiral was then published. Lucasfilm enforced their rules at first, but it seems that they quite quickly realised that they wouldn't be able to stop fans from publishing works that they didn't approve of. Maybe it would have been a waste of resources, or maybe they realised that it wouldn't irreparably damage the company's reputation. According to Sarah Khaleesi's paper, A Force to be Reckoned with, Women, Star Wars and Controlling Cultural Production, no fanzine publisher or fanfiction writer ever found themselves in court over copyrighted material or for violation of fanzine policy. But Lucasfilm's interference did mean that a lot of people stopped publishing adult works in Star Wars signs. This subject could absolutely be its own video, but if you want to look more into it, there's some good information on fan lore, and Luna Terra did a really good summarization of it in the r/hobby drama Reddit thread. One good thing to come out of this was that the zines that Lucasfilm collected were given over to fans, and these eventually became part of a huge fanzine archive run by Ming Wathney. This chapter seems to be the last major one in zine history. So I would like to mention an interesting opening statement from Sonic Screwdriver issue 3 from 1987, which feels as though it could have been written on Tumblr in 2014. Here's some extracts from it. Today we see the fanish world differently, and in part at least the difference is not a good one. For fandom, like so much else around it, has become politics. Wherever people congregate, no matter who they are or what their interests, they engage in the internal game. Power. That's what politics is all about. And that, unfortunately, has become as much a part of the fanish experience today as it is of the mundane world. Are you an avid reader of hardcore science fiction? Then, someone will tell you, you must look down on those who are interested in role-playing games. Is fantasy your principal interest? Then you must dislike purely scientific writing. Literature? Then cinema and television should be anathema to you. Or, conversely, you love a good science fiction film. Then obviously you hate all the science fiction literature. Or maybe, as is the sad case in far too much of the mundane world, you simply cannot read. And this, we are told, is what fandom today is all about. Someone, a faceless but influential someone, dictates a series of neat categories and all fans must fit tidily into them. If you are reading these words, you are, in all likelihood, a fan. That means you are part of fandom, and it is up to you, as a fan, to stand up to the dictators, the power seekers. It is up to you to tell them you will no longer meekly follow their rules. It is up to you to say you will believe what you believe, and not what you are told. That you will like what and whom you like, not what and whom someone else likes. It is up to you to make your own decisions, whatever they may be, and to stand up for them. To do otherwise makes fandom no different at all from that mundane world which we so often claim to scorn. If there is anything at all special and unique about fans, it must be this. For in the end, fandom is fans, not politics, but only if the fans themselves make it so. I don't know, that just feels very familiar to me, as if it could have popped up in my feed in relation to some drama that I had no idea was going on. So it's really interesting to know that fandom discourse has always existed, and that the idea that there's a right or wrong way to be a fan has never really gone away. Zines in the 1980s were up against increased merchandising of media properties, and this may have made them less appealing to new members of fandom. There are certainly many still being published and in circulation throughout the 80s. A lot of Doctor Who fans were published within this time, and there was discussion around the new Star Trek movies that were coming out, and then later The Next Generation. Obviously, computers also became more accessible to the average person in the 90s, so zines could be made more easily, or they could be moved online entirely. The fanfic sites of the 2000s also meant that fics could reach a much wider audience who could give instant feedback, which was much more appealing than writing into a physical publication. For example, when The Phantom Menace came out, there was a handful of physical zines, but most of the fanworks were online. An online fic archive was launched as soon as 2 days after the movie's premiere. Non-fandom zines were also popular during this time. Underground, feminist, queer, and punk zines were making the rounds, and it is often these kinds of publications that people think of nowadays when the word zine is said. I focused mainly on the big fandom zines for this video, but obviously they existed for many different works of media, for music, for horror, for comic books, sport. If you can think of something that people were fans of, then there was probably a zine for it. There were so many cool zines that I came across on the Internet Archive, and I would definitely recommend searching around for them if you can. I also just got incredibly distracted reading through zines on making this video. I read so many that I've not even mentioned. I bought these fanzines that I've not even had time to delve into, so I might do a separate video on that where I maybe look at the content in specific zines. I don't know if you're interested in that sort of thing. We've also come such a long way from fanfic being on unsure and rocky legal ground to published works like 50 Shades of Grey, or that Harry Styles series that's now a film series, or the 5 million Raylo romance ripoffs that Waterstones is desperately trying to advertise to me. Is that a good thing? I mean, I do genuinely believe that it's great that people can get their creative start in writing fanfiction, and I'm not going to be protective over the characters that are owned by some mega corporation. Are these published stories good art? That's up for debate, but there's clearly a market for it, so I can't blame somebody wanting to make money off their work. To clarify, I am a big supporter of fanworks. I'm very grateful that the Organisation for Transformative Works exists. I don't think there should be restrictions on what people can or can't write. Not everything is something that I'm personally interested in, and that's fine. Also, corporations need to realise that fanworks is basically free advertising. I know I've watched a TV show or a movie because I've seen cool artwork online and seen people discussing it. Zines also still exist today. There are zine libraries around the world. People sell their zines online or at conventions. Some are still fandom related, but most are artistic or political, and there's some really beautiful work out there. There are online zines too. Apparently there was a big boom in Instagram zines in the 2020 lockdown, and if you search the zine tag on Tumblr, you'll get art zines, D&D zines, queer zines, so much more. Essentially what I've discovered from this research is that I love fans and fandom, and people have always been people. They've always had their obsessions, their passions, their connection to these little fictional people that live on screens or in book pages or in our heads. There's always been discourse and infighting and weird little dramas. Creativity is great, whether that's writing a 3-act movie with a good budget or writing a smutty little one-shot about Jar Jar Binks and Queen Julia getting it on. Bye!